Today I'm going to talk about the book of Job. The book of Job is one of the most famous books of the Bible, and it is dealing with maybe the hardest problem, the most difficult, the most complex problem for any monotheistic religion. Remember that monotheism means belief in one God. So if we're talking about Judaism or Christianity or Islam, we have a difficulty because the question is, why do bad things happen to good people? And why do good things happen to bad people? All of us have known somebody who was innocent and good and righteous and who suffered greatly. All of us have known about children who have passed away long before their time. And there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. It seems to be random. It seems to be bad luck. And the hardest problem of all, of course, is the Holocaust. How could the Holocaust happen? How could God let it happen? All of these problems are familiar to any human being. But if you believe in God, you have a special problem. The problem is, again, if it's a righteous world, if God rewards the good and punishes the evil, how could such a thing happen? So you would think that the Bible would have one answer. And the one answer would go very simply like this. God rewards the righteous and punishes the evil. Over and over again, throughout the Bible, that's what our prophets say, that's what our scribes say, that's what our scholars say, that's what everybody says. Over and over again. As a matter of fact, there are whole books of history called the Deuteronomic history, whether it's the book of Joshua or the book of First and Second Samuel, the books of First and Second Samuel, the books of First and Second Kings. All of this is putting a grid onto history saying these things happened when the Jewish people were good, these things happened when the Jewish people were bad. And everything has a rhyme or reason, and everything makes sense, and God is always just. But it doesn't always feel that way, does it? And so then comes along, there's a story about a man named Job. And we read this story, and there is prose and there is poetry. Let me explain. The first couple of chapters are a story about a man named Job, and I'll tell it to you in a few minutes. And then the last chapter sort of sums things up. And what seems to happen is this. There is a man named Job, and I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember Ben Cartwright. He is the richest man. He has the Ponderosa. But we see a little hint at the beginning of the story. It says he lived in the land of Uz. There's no land of Uz. And already we see, gee, this is a fable. This is a story, a fictional story, to teach us a lesson. Okay, that somehow allows us to understand the story better, because we're not dealing with facts. So there's this land in this mythical kingdom of Uz. By the way, if that sounds like Oz, it's because at least some people think that Frank L. Baum took the land of Oz from the land of Uz, this faraway, mystical, magical land. And there's a guy named Job, and he's perfect. He's perfect. I know you think that no human being can be perfect, but he was perfect. He did everything right. And he had 7 children, and they would party every night. Why? Because their father was Ben Cartwright, and they didn't have to work, they didn't have to do anything. And he was so righteous, Job, that he would go and make sacrifices for each of his children because he was worried that maybe they'd said something or they'd done something that was wrong. So he was not only innocent and clean and perfect himself, he wanted to protect those around him. Scene shifts up to heaven. And here is God sitting on his throne, and all his angels are there. And there is one angel called Hasatan. This is very important. Hasatan sounds like Satan, but it's Hasatan, which means the Satan, and the Satan means the adversary angel. I like to call him the divine attorney, the DA. So he's a prosecuting attorney, and his job is as an angel, as a malach, as a messenger, is to go around on earth and then report back to God and say, so-and-so is not good. So he comes back to the throne room, and God says, where you been? And he says, I've been to and fro among human beings. So God says, well, you must have seen my main man, Job. He's perfect. And Hasatan says, yeah, of course he's perfect. You gave him the Ponderosa. Everything's wonderful. What does he have to complain about? If he would have bad luck, if some bad things would happen, you'd see how fast he would turn away from you. And God says, all right, let's bet, right? And so what you can do, I give you the power, because remember, Hasatan is not like the Satan. He's not the devil. He doesn't have any power to do anything on his own. Only God can allow it. God says, I allow you to zap him. But you can't touch him physically. You can attack anything else, but you cannot touch him physically. And all of a sudden, we shift back to earth, and terrible things are happening. All of Job's children are killed. His farms, the Ponderosa is destroyed. All of his livestock. Terrible things, one thing after another. And Job is left bereft. Job is left with his wife, who doesn't seem to be the nicest person on earth. And basically she says to him, get it over with. Blaspheme God and die. And she's, I'm sure, bitter with everything, but somehow she blames him, which doesn't seem quite fair. And but Job does not. He doesn't do anything wrong. He doesn't say anything wrong. He doesn't say anything against God. And then when more things happen, because the scene shifts back again to heaven, and God says, you see, I told you that Job would not go against me, that he would have faith in me. Hasatan says, yeah, but you didn't let me hit him physically. So now God says, okay, you can do that. We're going to up the bet. And Hasatan hits him physically, and now he's got this horrible skin stuff, these boils, and he's taking the pottery shard, and he's like tearing at his flesh. It's horrible. And now he's in terrible physical pain, but he says, should we not take the bad with the good from God? I got all this good. Shouldn't I take the bad? And so that leads, these two chapters in prose lead to what the Christian Paul said is the patience of Job. And I hear that all the time from Jewish people and non-Jewish people alike, the patience of Job. Well, those people only read the first two chapters, because then for something like 37, 38 chapters after that, Job screams at God. He's no longer patient. He's impatient to an extreme. And he screams at God and says, look, I know I didn't do anything wrong. And we, the reader, know he didn't do anything wrong, and God knows he didn't do anything wrong. And so do you know what an Archimedean point is, like from geometry? There's one point, and that's your point, and you start with that, and you build whatever you're going to build from there. So Job's Archimedean point is he's innocent. He didn't do anything wrong, and we know that that's true. It's not like it's special pleading. It's not like he's evasive. But then come all these friends, these three friends, and in this dialogue, one after another is saying, you must have done something wrong because God rewards the righteous and punishes the evil. So if you're being punished, you must have done something evil. Come on, what did you do wrong? And Job says, you don't know what you're talking about. I didn't do anything wrong. And again, we know it's true. And this goes on for chapter after chapter, but this idea that Job was patient is belied already in chapter 3, where Job, and this is all now poetry, and Job is screaming, I wish I would never have been born. This is horrible. Why did God allow me to be born, to have this life, to have this pain, to have this terrible existence? So this goes on back and forth, and then another guy comes named Elihu, and he says, look, God only, you've heard this before, I hate it, but you've heard it before, God only gives you what you can take. He's going to take you to the brink, but he's going to bring you back. It's going to be all right, and how is that fair? So this goes on for all of these chapters, and Job says something quite remarkable. He says, God, I would like to sue you. Can you imagine? Is this not called blasphemy? Is this not called heresy? God, I am so sure that I'm innocent that I want to take you to trial, and you can be the judge. And I will prove to you that you were wrong, that you were unjust. We remember from the book of Genesis, Abraham says to God, shall not the judge of the world do justly? Shall not the one who taught us justice do justice himself? And Job says, I'm so sure of myself and of my innocence that I will take you to court. So this goes on and on for all these chapters of incredible poetry and incredible anger. And in Job's anger, we feel our anger for all the injustices of this world, for all the good people that have been punished and all the evil people that have gotten away with it. And then finally, God speaks out of the whirlwind. And he never answers exactly. He says, were you there when I created the world? Were you there when I created the seas and the stars and the crocodiles and everything else? And that's his answer. And Job puts down his head. Now we're finally back to prose in the last chapter. And he says, all right, you're God and I'm not. I get it. But we haven't gotten an answer. Because, by the way, we know the answer. We know the answer is that there was an off-track bet in heaven between God and Hasatan. But Job never learns that. God doesn't say, here's why this happened. It was a test of human beings. It was a test to see whether a human being really can be perfect. But let's think for a minute about the word faith. What does it mean to believe in God? One idea is that to believe in God means to believe that there is a God. The other one is to believe in God's justice. Belief in God's justice is called theodicy. That's the fancy word. So, do we believe in God, or do we believe that God is always just? And Job's answer is, I believe in God. I never go out of that circle of faith. I'm inside that circle of faith. But I don't believe that God was just to me. Therefore, I can't believe that God is always just. And that seems to be what the book of Job is saying. At the end, in this last chapter of Job, which goes back to the prose, we go back to that, to prose, and in that prose framework, Job gets everything back. He gets kids, but they're not the same kids; they're new kids. I'm very delighted that he has these very beautiful daughters, and one is named Jemima, because I grew up with Aunt Jemima pancakes. Without their syrup, there's no. It's like the spring without the fall. If there's nothing worse in this universe, and that's no Aunt Jemima at all, something like that. Anyway, her name is Jemima. That's where the name comes from. He gets everything back, and he lives a long life, and he's richer than ever before, and everything's terrific. But we're sort of left to think about some things. First of all, this book goes against all the other books of the Bible. All the other books of the Bible say God rewards the righteous and punishes the evil. In this case, it doesn't happen. So what do we do with this? In a sense, this book is subversive. But it also opens a door for those of us who do have questions. And we're allowed to ask questions. We're allowed to scream at God. That's a very Jewish thing. Again, Abraham takes on God. Moses takes on God when he's on top of Mount Sinai. The second Isaiah says, we've been punished twice what we deserve. Ezekiel says, how long are you going to do this? This is not fair. We have a lot of people in the Bible questioning God and even accusing God of injustice. And that's okay. Yisrael, Israel, means those who wrestle with God. We're allowed to wrestle with God. That's our name. That's our very nature. We're allowed to question. So that's comforting for a lot of us. So how does the book of Job relate? Again, I think it doesn't. And I think that's the point. It is not the same as a lot of the other books of the Bible. It's very different. And in that is a certain beauty. And the beauty is called pluralism. That is, we're allowed to be honest with our emotions. We're allowed to take on everybody. We're allowed to speak truth to power. As a matter of fact, we're supposed to speak truth to power, even if it's God. We should never say something we don't mean. If you're praying and you see a prayer and you don't mean that prayer, don't say that prayer. Who are you fooling? You? You're fooling God? Who are you fooling? Don't do it. Skip that prayer. For a long time, I skipped the second paragraph of the Shema until I understood it better. That's a different subject. And now I say it because I understand it better. So this is a little bit about the book of Job. It's a door open. It opens a door for those of us who have questions. Now, let's go back to what God says to Job and why he's comforted. I think that Job's comforted just for the very fact that God spoke to him. My father, may he rest in peace, Rabbi Samuel Skolnick used to say this. It's not what God says. It's not the content. It's that he speaks to him. I don't mean to trivialize it, but there's some Tom Cruise movie, Jerry Maguire, I think it was, and he's gone away from the girlfriend, and he comes to the door and he starts talking, and she said, "You had me at hello," something like that. Just that God speaks, just that God cares about him. God never admits why this happened, doesn't tell him why it happened. We don't need that because we know. But there's something beautiful just about that God does talk to him. And so Job says, all right, look, I know you're there. I believe that you were there. You're there. You're answering me. You care enough to answer me. And that's good enough. Sometimes in our lives with other people, it's not so much what we say. It's just that we're there. Just that we make that phone call. And so I think God sort of teaches us that lesson here too. So the book of Job is a subversive book. It's an open book. And the word that's on my mind is pluralism. There are different books of the Bible saying different things. And sometimes they duel with each other and they question each other. And that's the nature of Judaism.